Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Creative Climate Chat. My name is Salome Wagaini, and I'm Programme Manager for Season for Change, a UK-wide cultural programme inspiring urgent and inclusive action on climate change. A few bits of housekeeping before we get going. So the conversation today will be recorded. Please use the Q&A function for any questions you have throughout. If you do have any technical difficulties, our tech host Eve Allen is on hand to help resolve them. Please use the chat function to flag any issues and select to panelists. Otherwise, messages will be defaulted to all attendees. Today's session is captioned, and so for captioning, at the bottom right of your screen, you'll see a subtitles button next to the share screen. Please use this to view the captions and transcript. And please join the conversation on your preferred social channels using hashtag #season4change, as well as hashtag creative climate chat. And Farah, do you have a poll for today?
Actually, no, we don't. We're gonna go straight in.
Amazing. So I'll give a bit more information on what Season for Change is and what creative climate chats are. So running until July 2021, Season for Change showcases the creativity and leadership of the UK's cultural sector on the climate crisis through 15 artistic commissions, an open programme which everyone is welcome to join, and Season for Exchange, a series of free online talks and conversations that are running until the 24th of June to inspire artists, activists, scientists and arts professionals to learn, share knowledge and talk about climate action and climate justice. The project is led by Arts Admin and Julie's Bicycle, delivered in collaboration with partners nationwide and supported by Arts Council England and Paul Hamlyn Foundation. This afternoon session is a creative climate chat hosted in conjunction with Julie's Bicycle. While spaces remain closed, the impulse to return to life as it was compelling, but COVID-19 has exposed the fragility of business as usual, the unfairness, damage and vulnerability that has affected so many people, not least the creative community. So Julie's Bicycle started their Creative Climate Chat series, conversations with leading thinkers in culture and climate to discuss the issues and offer some fixes from their perspective. These have covered culture in the just transition, new economics for a regenerative economy, the net zero carbon challenge, and climate justice. And today, Farah Ahmed will be in conversation with Araceli Carmago. Farah is Climate Justice Lead and Events Coordinator at Julie's Bicycle. There she works on The Colour Green, which provides resources, training and events for the arts and culture sector to embed climate and environmental justice in their work. Farah is also a co-founder and facilitator of Diaspora Dialogues for Our Futures, a reflective space for people of colour to centre collective care in the face of the climate crisis. And Araceli is lead scientist at Centric Lab and a cognitive neuroscientist focused on how our environments affect our health. Araceli Carmago is of Indigenous American descent and considers her work as fighting for health and environmental justice. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Salome. And thank you everyone for joining us for today's Creative Climate Chat. And we'll be taking a bit of a deeper look at the interconnection of health injustice and the climate crisis. And the last year and a half has really shown the world the really undeniable importance of robust and holistic health policy, not just within national borders, but globally. And this has many parallels with how governments and communities and scientists and civic organizations could respond to the climate and the environmental crisis. It's all connected. You know, scientists and environmental campaigners have been warning for years of the increasing likelihood of pandemics as we encroach further into previously unexploited natural spaces. and in some other unexpected ways too. For example, as permafrost melts in polar regions, we're seeing reemergences of viruses that had been trapped in the soil and the ice. The injustices that we witness around climate and health are also connected. You know, India is one of the biggest exporters of the COVID vaccine in the world, but due to a combination of local governance and global exploitation by structures like vaccine patents, it's now also one of the hardest hit countries in the world, while also facing climate impacts of, you know, 2 cyclones hitting the coasts and these sort of multiple crises. And here in London, you might have heard of the tragic case of Ella Kissy Deborah, who died at 9 years old and is the first person in the UK to have air pollution listed as her cause of death. So as we start to re-enter the world, we can't go back to the way things were. For many of us, it's not possible. We're grieving, people are suffering long-term impacts of long COVID. And because the cost of like the old normal was just too high, so we need alternatives that center and value the natural world and vulnerable and frontline communities. So I'm really pleased to be joined today by Araceli Carmago, who you've heard a little bit about in the introduction. So thank you for joining us. And before we begin, you've prepared a short reading. So I'll hand over to you, Araceli, to talk us through that. You're muted.
So what do you call it? So many months and still. So yeah, thank you very much for the platform and for the organizing the event. So I wanted to start with more of a reflection and a prayer, and this is a dedication to the people in Palestine. When we talk about all of the different things that are happening, and there's so many multiple parts, sometimes it's useful to distill it down to a core element. And one of the core elements that we have been looking at Centric, thanks to a collaboration with one of my best friends, Julian Knox, who is a poet, and he is also a creative director. He asked me to, he said, can you put all your sciencey stuff into something more accessible? So this is what we came up with. So breath is life. Through the transference of oxygen, the birth of oxygen started deep in the stars, including our sun star. From there, it transferred itself onto our planet. We don't quite understand the mechanics of it, but it transferred itself. And one of the first beings that it came into was cyanobacteria. So this humble unicellular bacterium that is still with us today in the form of spirulina is an example of one of them. From that little instance, that little nugget, it's where everything sprung up, which is the second principle, that breath is a promise, that with every breath and with every bit of oxygen that we intake, is that we're living through the promise that Mother Nature gave to us, that life would be abundant and that life would be diverse. Breath is also biological. It's got very specific mechanisms as to how we interact and relate with our environment. It's probably one of the most core touchstones between us and our external environment. As we breathe in the oxygen, it goes through our entire system, through our bloodstream. And by system, I mean it goes through every single organ, through the blood, through our capillaries, reaching every single bit of tissue. So our entire ecosystem of different organs and tissues and cells can function. So there's not a single factor or element in our body that is not touched by oxygen, or in which case it's not touched by nature itself. Therefore, breath is also sacred, because breath is that connection, that relationship with nature, with that life source. But as we are seeing, breath is also political. That is what many of us who are part of the colonized, part of the people that are oppressed, that is what they take away from us. They take away our breath and our connection with the sacred. Therefore, what they are doing is a form of sacrilege. So our brothers and sisters in Palestine, their breath is literally being taken away, not just in their death or in their passing, but also in the trauma that is being inflicted, in the fact that their nature has been completely depleted, even going into the water, which is technically one of their borders, isn't allowed. They're also being depleted in terms of the food and the nourishment. So all of those disconnections are happening in Palestine. And therefore that sacred connection, something so deep, is being taken from them. And breath is also very healing. So we, and by we, I mean in the academic world, because the Chinese, indigenous Chinese medicine and Hinduism, they understood, and as I am learning now, also Islam has known for a very long time that breath is healing. So we are only in the sciences starting to understand how that works. It is healing in the most immediate sense. And when we take a deep breath, we engage the vagus nerve, which actually brings down our changes the way that our cortisol mediates the production of cortisol, which is one of the hormones that responds to when we are in stress. And it calms us down. That's in its immediacy. But of course, in its long term, when we are breathing in properly, those deep, deep breaths, because as I said, the oxygen that comes in, but also not just oxygen, when we are in deep biodiversity, we're also taking in microbes that are essential to our gut. We are then re-nourishing, replenishing our system. And so that is why we have practices, ancient practices of dance. The djembe drum is a sacred instrument. To play it and to dance it, you need deep breath. The peoples of Turtle Island, running is a sacred act as well. Running long distances is part of a prayer. Again, that exercise forces you to take deep breaths. And of course, things like yoga and meditation and prayer as well. And so I think when we're talking about climate change, what we're really talking about is the perseverance of breath. And so we have said that that's where the revolution is. The revolution is the breath. It's being able to ensure that everyone that's been disconnected with the breath, been disconnected from Mother Earth, that they reconnect again. So from that side, I am done.
Thank you so much. That was really beautiful, and also reminded me to breathe. Sitting here, you know, we don't often sort of give ourselves those reminders to really notice our breath, and to notice it in our bodies as well. So thank you for that really wonderful, beautiful reading. And for connecting it also to all of the injustices and the oppressions that we see and that have been happening for decades and for centuries. And really, those are at the heart of the climate injustices that we're seeing now. They're all connected, they're all following this real lineage of oppression, and that taking away of the breath. Can you tell us maybe a little bit about your work at the Centric Lab and how you bring all of those beautiful bits through into that research work?
So the core of our work is that we study the HPA axis. Sorry, I didn't think I had any acronyms, and now I just realized that I have that one. So it's the hypothalamic, pituitary, adrenal axis. It's a full system, so it is how the brain is mediated by our hormonal system, and then our hormonal system is then mediated again by the brain, specifically in what we have identified as the stress response. The stress response is a necessity because it allows us to be able to adapt to the environment. So very simply, if the weather outside, for example, were to get uncomfortably cold, our bodies would go through a very specific system of changes from, for example, our breath would change. How many breaths we are intaking would change. In turn, that would send a message about how many heart pumps per minute our body would take, which would then change the way that our muscle and even our perspiration would begin to work. So that adaptation is necessary. And then our body then knows how to then bring itself back to homeostasis. And it does it through everything. For example, again, when you're running, it's doing the same thing. It's readjusting. And then if you come back down and walk, it does something else. But the important is that as you're running, your body is going through these mechanisms of adaptation, so you are able to run. And the problem is that what we're seeing is that when the stress response is asked to engage again and again and again, that is one of the key pathologies to diseases. And in the way that capitalism has created the world that we're all subjected to, means that we are getting stressors psychosocially, as in the worry of dealing with something like COVID, economic instability, fear for our lives, the mourning of loved ones. All of those are compounded because we don't necessarily have any respite. They come one after another after another. The other thing is that we also have environmental stresses. So especially in urban environments such as air, noise, light, pollution, that again, every single day asks our body to adapt. So our bodies never get the chance to heal, to go through that healing process after the adaptation process. And that is one of the central lines to diseases. And as a neuroscientist, I am interested in the non-communicable diseases such as depression and anxiety, obesity, and diabetes. And then also, I would say conveniently, these are also the diseases that are plaguing most of humanity and need to be resolved, because at the moment, none of the diseases that I have mentioned have at least a Western form of solution.
And why is it so important to link all of those to those health injustices and those issues that are impacting many of us, to climate injustice specifically?
Well, okay, so let's unpack a little bit. So I would say that we need to talk about, instead of just talking about climate change, we need to look at the deregulation, oppression, destruction of our planet. So just as people are owned, oppressed, and marginalized, our planet has had that same exact treatment. So today we're working on a new report called Living in Symbiosis with Nature, and our research led us to, because I was interested in, how exactly did we get here? And there was a research study that we found that as in the 5th century, or you can go as back as the 5th century, when feudalism was taking, I guess, over Europe. So Europe graduated from a clan-based society over to a feudalistic society. And by that was those who own land, those who didn't. But those who own land, they were interested in owning the land for quote unquote productivity, what the land was going to give to them, but productivity in terms of, I would say capitalistic value, rather than the value that nature already has, which is to sustain our life. It's stupid to want the earth to be more productive than giving us life and sustaining our lives. But there you have it. And so there, what they realized is that as that feudalistic system took over, so did disease. And there are many pathways to that. It was because the soil became disrupted, and therefore when soil becomes contaminated or becomes sick or becomes degraded, the food source that comes from it is not as good. But also when you're doing that type of work and you're not paying attention to the ecosystemic effects, you also degrade water supplies and you degrade biodiversity supplies that we need to be healthy. Not to mention that the working hours of the people that were classified as peasants, they had horrible working conditions. And that's where that trajectory set us off. So technically, we've been in this trajectory or subjected to this trajectory for 16 centuries. That is a long time to be doing the wrong thing. So that is why we link it all, because we cannot talk about our health as humans without talking about the health of the planet, because they are intrinsically tied. And that's again why we really like working or speaking about the breath as almost our creative outlet for what we're looking at, because if you're breathing in not just polluted air, but unnourished air, because you're not taking in the microbes that you should be taking in, then your body doesn't get that healing. Your body then also on top of it gets poisoned. And again, you are then breaking that promise with Mother Nature, that Mother Nature promised the abundance of life on this planet.
Wow, there's so much to think about and so much to unpack in that. But I think there's something in there about that promise. You recently released a report about nature as health, and you talk about that in the start. What I really liked about it and appreciated about it was the reframing of language around nature at the very beginning of the report. So instead of referring to nature as it, as that, as separate, it's they, it's something that's on an equal level, that is in a mutually sustaining relationship with us as humans. And it's we've been taught, many of us, in the West, to see ourselves as separate, distinct, or in a hierarchy with nature, but that's not the case at all. How does reframing how does reframing nature and what it gives to us in that mutually beneficial way supportive to health and to talking about health justice?
So firstly, Indigenous cultures around the world, they do have still that kingship. So the Aboriginals have a direct relationship. Their relative is a non-human animal that they pick through ceremony that they have. And the same thing with us on the other side of the planet, because again, because from feudalism we went to capitalism, you have to create hierarchy, you have to separate yourself in order to justify why you're going to destroy an ecosystem. And I can't remember his name. I want to say maybe William Locke. Is that a guy? Is that I'm sure it is a guy. But if anybody knows the history of land and land productivity, I'm not good with remembering names. But anyway, some white man, when he went over to Turtle Island, he said that we didn't deserve the land because we didn't know how to make it productive, whilst not understanding that there was a deep relationship already, as you should. I mean, if you speak to a farmer, they have a deep relationship with the land. You have to pay attention to the land, and you can't contradict nature, because if you do, you get hurt, right? But we do that all the time, which is quite interesting. That, for example, I am from Florida, and people insist on putting their homes right next to mangroves, and then get very surprised as to why their homes get flooded. And so we're always contradicting. We always think that we're above nature, but like I said, it serves that narrative of capitalism. So if we're going to move away from that, then we need our own language, and we need a more accurate language. Nature is alive. All of nature is a being. So in English, sometimes it can be very egotistical as a language, and the fact that it even has an it is quite interesting in terms of studying it as a philosophical side of language, that it has an it, because it you buy, and it you can oppress, and it you can own, and it doesn't have a being, a soul, an entity of its own. It doesn't have sovereignty. And so again, then it becomes really easy. And they didn't just do it to non-human nature, they did it to us as people as well. And they justified it by saying that we too didn't have a soul. When the Bible came through, it was, well, these people have souls, these people do not have souls, so that's okay. But, the enactment of violence that we're going to put upon them. And so that's why it's important to justice, because justice needs its own language. We cannot speak the language of the colonizer, and we cannot speak the language of oppression. So it's being disciplined about changing the way that we frame things, because language does that, right? It changes our cognitive, our cognitive schemas, right? That once you know that nature is alive and you can't call it, I really do suggest to do it as an exercise, and to call it your friend, your kin, your relationship. It changes everything. It changes completely the way that you see non-human nature. And that's what language is about, for it to do that.
That's it's a really interesting framing. I grew up in a Muslim household, and there's certain prayers you do, even though it was a very meat-eating household, for example. There's prayers that you have to say when you kill an animal for meat, for example. It's about the respect for the life that is being taken in order to sustain the life. And there's lots of sort of other examples of that throughout the world. And you explore the idea of community sovereignty as well. What does that mean, and how does it offer us also alternative ways of organizing and fighting for justice?
So sovereignty is a word used a lot in justice movements, and it's the idea that you can have, so that you and your peoples have the ability of self-governance. Because again, for those of us on Turtle Island and on Sister Island, being South America, we don't, right? We don't. Evo Morales was our first indigenous president in all of what is now the Americas. And we have no governance over anything, really. If anything, we are forced to assimilate into the system. And so, but that patterning, again, capitalism isn't very inventive. For 16 centuries, it hasn't, as I said, this has been happening for a very long time. It just cuts and pastes everywhere. And so that system, we see it at a level of a nation state, but we also can see it in terms of localized communities, that we think that, for example, we live in a democracy. Everybody probably, if I said, is London a democracy, would be like, yeah, it's a democracy, but do you have any say at all about the habitat that you're living in? Type of house you have, is the house safe? The environment, air, noise, light, the water that you're drinking, do you have any governance about how clean it is? Do you know how clean it is? We don't even know that. We don't know if if the new development that's coming in, how that's going to affect our health. We have no say in how it's going to change our life. Therefore, the making of our cities and the making of our habitats from a capitalistic perspective is an autocracy, because no one has any sovereignty. And so when communities fight for justice, i.e. environmental justice, where they say, no, I am not living next to a landfill site. No, I'm not going to live next to a gasworks site that is being developed. In Chicago, citizens went on a hunger strike about 3 months ago to stop a recycling plant going into their neighborhood. In such a deep, severe protest of how sick already the community was getting. And so that's what we mean, that number one, a community should have sovereignty. They should be able to govern themselves. We really don't need an architect, no offense to the architects, but we don't need an architect to come into a community to tell you what you need. A community is able to understand how it needs to evolve, because all organisms do that. We don't tell ourselves, I mean, if we did, we'd probably mess it up, but we don't tell ourselves this is how you need to do it. We don't tell any other part of nature, this is how you should be governed. Other parts of nature don't tell other parts of nature, because we do love to dictate to Mother Nature. But a tree doesn't impose on the fungi flora that it has. It works in symbiosis, but we don't do that. But it's also about honoring that community sovereignty and being respectful of the sovereignty of the community, and learning to work in symbiosis, not just with nature, but with each other. If you are going to go ahead and do that, then we're going to go ahead and do this. And what we're doing in this community should not be at the detriment of the other community. And that's the other term that we're looking at, is mutualistic symbiosis. We're talking about it with nature, but we are part of nature, that we also have to do that with each other. And it's very important, because so many times, I would say all of the time, when a community says, this is going to pollute our water, we are going to get sick, that's exactly what happens. And it's not that they don't understand the solution, because they do. They are then, on top of that, they're not allowed to enact their solutions to it. And like I said, we see that micro, macro, and and internationally.
And it's quite interesting, because those very same communities are often the people who the environmental movement or policymakers or people who are in charge of this, they aren't interested or don't know anything about it or don't care, and it's deeply untrue. Of course people care about the air that they're breathing and the water that they're drinking and the homes that they live in, but are denied access to that sovereignty.
Yeah. And I think that's part of another term that we are looking to define, which is knowledge supremacy, that only certain knowledge pools are valid. And again, it's just another form of oppression, because when a community of course knows how to identify the hazards that are within them and also the solutions, but the powers be tell, whether it's a policymaker or bigger government or a developer, they come and ask, well, where is the evidence? And you mentioned Ella at the beginning of your talk. 12 years it took Rosamond to get justice, and technically it's not really justice for her daughter. She got an acknowledgement, but I wouldn't say it's justice, because she's still breathing the same air. So it's 12 years from where she started advocating to now. That procrastination is part of the oppression, and it's also Rosamond not getting her own sovereignty, her own ability to govern and say, I need this change for my neighborhood, and I need it now.
And it's very, I actually live in Hither Green in South London, right around the corner from Rosamond and from where Ella lived, and it's very difficult knowing those that justice has not been had, because nothing has changed, and if anything, it's gotten worse. And there's no real connection between the knowledge of what happened to Ella and the sort of solutions being proposed quite often. But
because Rosamond herself hasn't been, I'm watching, she hasn't been platformed technically in terms of, is Rosamond now part of the Lewisham Council? I don't know, maybe she is, but I don't, is Rosamond now an MP? Is Rosamond now being given the authority as an expert on air pollution? I mean, technically she also understands it biologically because she saw what her daughter went through.
So how do we create these systems and these ways to feel empowered within our own communities to improve the health of us in a physical way, but also mentally and not just within our bodies, but for the planet, for the nature that surrounds us?
Well, the first thing is to acknowledge that nature is our partner in this. Nature doesn't need us doing anything. It doesn't need, in fact, we just need to leave it alone. In terms of capitalism, it needs to leave it alone, I should say. I should be specific. But nature is our teacher, and we have to turn to them and ask, okay, where do we need to go? And it's very, very specific, right? What an ecosystem needs in the Sahel is very different to what an ecosystem needs in Florida, right? And so it takes building that relationship with the place that you are in, with nature, and understanding how all of its ecosystems come together, how all its components come together. And then humans can be like, okay, what is my reciprocity in this? Now that I understand it, how do I give back? Is it that I need to reintroduce a type of species and need to nourish it? Is it that I just need to step back and let it flourish all on its own? But it is having that humility that it is not us as humans that will present a solution. It is in us of planet and the rest of the biodiversity. For example, look at trees. They know how to filter our air. Beavers, they know how to make our rivers more rich in sedimentation and nourishment. They're little engineers and architects. So there's a lot, I would say there's an abundance of knowledges that are coming from nature itself that we just need to pay attention and not think that it's just going to be us. The second thing is all the right people are engaged in a forward movement. We're all, and we have been for a very long time. I think there is a myth that those of us that go through injustice, regardless of what it is, that we passively go through it, right? That we're just awaiting for change to come, or that we're just awaiting for engagement with us to happen. No, we're there. What the Zapatistas are doing in terms of their schooling, their organic growing, and the way that they're reshaping, reframing how the society that they want to live in is super dope. And they've been doing that for decades. The Sahel right now, by the indigenous peoples of the area, are going back to indigenous technologies of the past, and they are successfully now rebuilding the Chad Lake that has been massively depleted because of industry. So the change is there and it is happening. I think maybe we need to start asking the capitalist and the oppressor, what are they going to do? More so than ask what we're going to do. In terms of Centric, because we have identified the phenomena of community sovereignty, we refrain from saying we're off to engage with a community and post a solution and do all this top-down mess. Instead, it's creating tools, what we call health infrastructure, that and it's important to note that the health infrastructure isn't necessarily because the communities don't know what the solutions are. Really, it's to create the bridge between the community and bureaucracy. That's where we see that there is a gap. So working with a couple of communities that are seeking cleaner air, they understand where the air pollution is coming from, and they understand that they are ingesting air pollution, and they understand the consequences, and they understand how to articulate it, and they understand what the solutions are. The problem is speaking to bureaucracy and getting bureaucracy to change. So that's where we're coming in and providing those tools to create that bridge, but very much accepting, again, that we are not the ones that are going to do anything. The communities understand what to do. And so I think maybe the last point to that is that we all have to trust each other. And like I said, work in symbiosis with one community, with another community, and go, what did you do? How did that work? Here's my tool, pass it along, and do some listening and some trusting, again, than thinking that change is this like macro movement, that it needs also, the mascots and all the shit that we usually see of, I don't know, like it gets branded and it gets on, like, y'all, we don't need all this. Change is on its way. It's been happening since the moment oppression started. That's when change started. And I don't think people quite understand that.
Yeah, I think about it, and the thing that always comes back to me is that sort of the idea of tree huggers. And I think some of you might have heard me talk about this before, but it was a movement that started in North India. It was an anti-colonial movement, and that entire history of fighting against oppression has been like sanitized out of that word tree hugger to mean, I don't know, something running around a meadow, but it is an inherently political act that was started by people who look like me, and who are from my background, and that is an inherently empowering thing to know as well, and to take for me personally, to take with me on my journey. And those are the sorts of things that we need to be understanding and platforming and talking about.
Yeah. I mean, that's a really good point, is that we shouldn't erase anybody, right? That in our each other's road to justice, we can't afford erasing somebody else's movement. And a lot of the times, as you said, the West, it really is until it clicks to them, then it finally is in sort of existence. No offense to Greta Thunberg, she was a child when she started, but the amount of children doing climate justice work around the world was abundant before that. And it wasn't until that happened that like the West was like, oh my God, children can get involved now. I'm like, children have been involved. And it's just this constant thing of like dealing with the slow people in the back that then think that they are then the leaders. So we have to be careful with erasure and not say, not make sure that we understand the history as well of justice. So we don't erase the movements. And so we know where things came from. So we, again, know how to move forward.
For everyone watching, please do send your questions in. We have a little bit of time. You can put that in the Q&A box. But while we're on this as well, so what's the role of artists and art within these sorts of conversations and movements? How do we engage with all of these, with nature and with health and with climate inequalities, with integrity?
Well, that's an interesting question because I'm not an artist. Well, one is being careful that, again, that the art is in symbiosis with nature, and it's not just another outlet of capitalism, because it can be. And by that, I mean the whole thing, that we're not just doing it for capital gain, but also that we're not simultaneously eroding nature again through it. Creative events very bad for the ecosystem. Lots of plastic, lots of toxic material that goes in, a huge burden on water systems and our air systems, etc. So there has to be a cognizance of that. But maybe, I don't know, maybe it's connection. I mean, maybe I should talk about the artistry that pulls me in. So I find how So for example, as I said at the very beginning, the djembe drum is a sacred instrument. How that instrument connected the peoples of West Africa to the breath, to ceremony, to healing. There's a whole work on looking at the djembe drum and healing. And I find that connection interesting. I don't know what the equivalent is at this moment in our modern times. The same thing with dance. Dance is an expression, again, can be used as healing. It can be used to call to Mother Nature and connect to Mother Nature. And it just gives you a connection because of the breath to the ground and to the earth that you are. And it's very much part of ceremony and connection. That's where I will say, I mean, and then maybe the final thing is the conversations that I've been having with my friend Julian. It's doing this project with him about the breath. So he is going to be touring a video that is got this gospel choir, but also mixed with Afrofuturism, Afro-indigeneity, visuals, and looking at the breath. And I do think people there connect because it's not coded through linguistic tools. There's a different way for people to psychologically understand and attach to the idea that the breath is sacred and the breath is completely connected to the health of our planet. So maybe it's that, like a conduit to that, is what I would say.
Brilliant. It's a very embodied way of approaching this connection, isn't it? We have a question from Asan Khan. So, as local councils are racing towards net zero, how can designers and artists get involved with local communities and council-funded projects to help drive the change we need?
Well, first of all, net zero is bullshit. That's not what we need. What has happened, the crisis isn't a climate crisis. Let's be very specific. The crisis is the degradation, the oppression, and the depletion of our planet, which one of the consequences is the deregulation of our climate. But we also have a deregulation of our microbiome, of our food systems, and of our biodiversity. A lot of the immune system of plants and non-human animals is also in peril. So net zero isn't going to solve the problem that we actually have at hand. So I would say don't engage with it because it doesn't solve the problem. The second thing, in terms of engaging with communities, I do think it's time that we change our language. You don't engage with communities, you are invited in by communities. It has to be consensual. You have to be invited in, you have to ask for invitation, and then ask them how you are useful, rather than the other way around. And yeah, it takes lots of conversations. It takes a lot of trust to develop. And it's also takes time. It's not, again, I don't want to cause offense, but it's not a question of we did a mural for a community, peace, we out. No, you have to build, if you're serious about it, it's building that relationship through time and that trust and seeing yourself as hopefully, if you have enough trust, you then become part of the community. And then you enter into that symbiosis.
Amazing. Okay. Do we have any other questions coming through? I guess that, so I'll ask one more question, which is something that we ask everyone, and this is about you personally, Araceli. What's your climate superpower? What do you bring to the table in this movement?
Yeah, I was looking at that question from before. I don't know. What I try to be disciplined about, and we try to build this into our team, it's listening. Being a very good listener. Listen to how people are evolving, communities are evolving, nature is evolving, so then we can understand how we move and evolve, right? That we have to understand that change is a process. So is injustice, so is justice. They are processes, they're not singular acts. They are singular acts within that process, but it's still a process. So I would say that I don't have a role. I just have or maybe that is my role. It's to listen.
There are so many multiple roles that people can inhabit, and we need so many of them. We need all of them connected, and it's always really interesting hearing how people situate themselves. I think that unless anybody else has any more questions, we've got a couple come through. Let's go to Tom. How can the use of, they're both quite connected. How can the use of materials in art making help the environment? So, for example, Tom is working on a sculpture that decays and becomes a part of the ecosystems, and someone, Madame Zucchini, is using humor and vegetable puppets.
Well, again, so, and we do the same thing, right? This is always from our side that we wouldn't say something that we don't live by. First is ask if it's needed. Is it needed? Because if it's not needed, quite frankly, we have to be humble enough to be like, I'm gonna sit down because it's not needed. And we have to be okay with that. 2, again, become a friend and build up your kinship with your, not kingship, sorry, your kinship with nature. There, I hope I pronounce it right, and I also remember their names. The Khasi people in northern India. I don't know if anybody knows of the area and or the peoples that I'm talking about. So they live in northern India. And for them, the rubber tree is the sacred tree. And they have the living bridges that obviously that connect from point A to point B. But they're living, they're alive. They keep the roots living of this tree. So there's even biodiversity within those bridges. What's interesting is that the biodiversity within those bridges is now its own ecosystem that is now needed for the macro biodiversity of that area. But 2, they are now little communities in that biodiversity of those bridges. So you can't knock a bridge down. It's sacred. Number 2, they're like, this is time. The bridges last hundreds of years because it's living. So it knows how to heal itself, recycle itself, etc. And so then there, the question is, how do you define art? To me, that is art. It's not just a bridge, it's visually beautiful. So I don't know, again, I'm not an artist, so I don't know how you want to define art, but maybe part of this journey is redefining what art is. there is the same, there's another, the Warori people in the Amazon, they create these baskets, and the way that they create the design of the basket is depending on the use of what they're going to have it. And that's every people, so it's not just unique to there. But what's interesting, so these baskets that they weave, they're technically biodegradable because it's used by natural material. They're put as little traps for crayfish or fish or whatever it is that is in season that they're about to catch. But what's interesting is that now the river is in symbiosis with this, because the river, they now ensure that the little fish keep swimming and they are away from the predators, so they flourish. It changes the current of the river just enough, again, to protect some of the younger ecosystems so they can flourish up. And all of that is controlled through the technique of their weaving and technically the design of their weave. So again, you can consider that art, or you may not, but in those two examples, it's we're in symbiosis with nature, we are useful to nature, and we are needed.
It goes back, that question of what is art goes back to that point about knowledge supremacy, doesn't it? You know, we have a certain way of defining art here, which isn't necessarily the way that many people think about art, or the way that that cultures are expressed is art, but isn't necessarily, you know, within a functional hierarchical system in the way that we think about it.
Well, then it maybe needs decolonizing, because I mean, if Damien Hirst was asking me this question, I would be like, just stop doing it. That's how you can help the earth. Because you are so expensive to the planet. Exactly. It is. His art is incredibly expensive to the planet and damaging. So
thank you so much, Araceli, and thank you so much for everyone joining us. I think that's all we've got time for. That was super interesting question.
Thank you. And can I just shout out Emma Dunton for giving me the Kasi people. She just put it into Wikipedia. And also Salome, thank you. Yes, it's John Locke. I am terrible at remembering semantics. I do think I have a little bit of a problem in my brain when it comes to semantics.
It's just because when I was like, oh, I've managed to finally use one of the 2 years I studied philosophy to good use. So amazingly, thank you. And genuinely, thank you so much, both Araceli and Farah, for this conversation. It's been really illuminating and a lovely way to spend this Thursday afternoon. So the season for exchange continues. Next Thursday, we'll be hosting a session called The Games We Play, where 3 artists who've used gaming, both analog, sort of card games and computer games, as a way to explore the climate crisis. And they will be sharing their process and experiences. So I hope to see some of you there. And thank you for coming.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good evening. Bye.